Today I'm going to be doing a review of the newest Christopher Ward C63 GMT. It's a pretty cool watch for a pretty aggressive price point, so let's see how good it is. We have a diameter of 39 millimeters, lug to lug of 45.9, height of 12 millimeters, and a lug width of 20. Some other general specifications for the watch: we're going to have the Sellita SW330 GMT movement beating way in here, which is nice because this is an upgraded version with a 56-hour power reserve. It beats at 28,800 vibrations per hour and all that good stuff too. Mine's currently running at around 5 seconds a day, so really can't complain. We have also 150 meters of water resistance with a screw-down crown, sapphire crystal on the front and the back. I believe they use some kind of AR coating, but they don't state what side it's on or anything, so either way, it's a fairly legible watch. And there's also Super Luminova X1 used for all the lume applied here in white, as you can see. And last but not least, the watch retails for $10.70 on bracelet, and that's before you apply the, kind of complimentary Christopher Ward $125 discount. So looking at the dial of the watch, we can see it's pretty simply done, and even though it has a little bit of added clutter with the GMT complication, it still is a pretty clean presenting dial. You can see we have baton markers all throughout with a double pip at 12 and a half pip at 6 just to compensate for the 6 o'clock date window, which is nice to see, not only because it is color matched, but it is at 6 o'clock, so it keeps a nice symmetry just with the watch design in general. Just with the other C63 watch I reviewed, the markers here are faceted towards the bottom, which give a nice little added depth to the watch, and I prefer that a lot more over just a plain flat regular baton because it's not as interesting. As you can see, the outer track has this white hash marks for every minute marker, and then at every 5-minute mark we have an orange rectangular pip alongside the actual numeral designation for the time, basically 5, 10, 15, 20, all that good stuff. The text is kept very minimally on the watch, which is really nice, just Christopher Ward at the top, automatic GMT, and the water resistance done in orange to match, of course, all the little orange elements. And then last but not least, the little Swiss made at the bottom, nice and tucked out of the way, so you don't really see it that often, and it doesn't kind of like stand in your face, and it's not that important anyway, so it's okay. Looking at the handset, I think Christopher Ward did a really good job here. Not only does this kind of like classic Christopher Ward arrowhead work really well with the sporty design, but the actual GMT is executed really well because half of the hand, as you can see, is done in this kind of black, which blends into the dial in a lot of kind of just orientations and doesn't stand out too much from the regular handset. And then the other half is done in this orange, which not only matches all the other orange accents on the dial, but obviously increases legibility a little bit, just looks nice, and of course is a nod to the old Rolex Explorer. Overall, I think Christopher Ward did an amazing job on the dial here. It looks nice, it has a very sporty feel, but it can be dressed up. It's not, of course, it's not a dress watch, but it's thin enough and wears well enough and isn't too in your face to where it can kind of play both worlds. And I think the orange is done very tastefully. It's not overpowering, and it is just a nice looking dial. So zooming in on the Christopher Ward here, we can see again there is that kind of brushed line down the middle of each of the hands, which gives a nice contrast for the polished edges. But you can clearly see there are some imperfections with the edges of the hands. It is kind of expected at this price point. Nothing's going to be perfect, and when all the rest of the kind of watches in such high quality, there's going to have to be some corners cut here and there. But overall, none of this can be really seen from like the wrist eye view, so it's not that big of a deal in my opinion. Looking at the GMT hand there, we can see there is a nice kind of glossy application to the arrow tip there. Really nicely done with the lume infill as well. There isn't any patchiness. It's pretty finely grained as well. So really nicely done overall. This angle I think gives a good idea about the depth of the seconds track as well as that little orange pip there. We see there is a little bit of roughness as well on the sides of the applied markers. Nothing too bad, and again I can't see it from wrist eye view, but at this magnifications you can clearly see that the edge of the top markers are done in this kind of brush finish, while the facet that curves towards the middle of the dial is done in a high polish, which gives a little bit more contrast. Looks really nice, and again gives a little bit more interest than just a flat and singularly finished marker. Overall, I think it's nice to see that there isn't any kind of like dust or particulate on the black dial itself. There is, of course, a little bit of roughness around the markers, but the dial itself is really cleanly done. The printing is really nicely done, and overall I think for the price, for the quality, for the just level of everything else that you're getting, this is a fairly really good done dial, and I really don't have many complaints, but there are some kind of small QC things Christopher Ward can pay a little more attention to. And then one thing before we move on, the date window, while black, is not quite as inky as the dial itself. The actual kind of numbers do have a nice depth to them, just like the rest of the text on the dial does, which is nice to see, but I would have liked to see a darker date window just to blend in slightly more. Moving on to the case of this watch, and if you already saw my three-hander review, it wears pretty much exactly the same. It is only 0.5 millimeter thicker, surprisingly, so it wears virtually the same as that watch. But if you haven't seen it, let's get into the watch. Looking generally at the case, we have a vertical brushing along the lug tops, this nice kind of chamfer along the side edge here. We can see there is a kind of just beautiful sculpting to the case itself with a nice downturn at the lugs that's going to help it wear ergonomically on wrist. Of course, Christopher Ward twin flag there. There is a kind of nice three-piece construction to this case as well, with the fairly thin mid case, the kind of top bezel portion, and the case back. And because the case back really just sits into the wrist, you only have that much of the watch's thickness really standing out to you, and this really takes away about 1 millimeter or 2, so it does wear similar to a nicely wearing kind of 10 millimeter watch. One thing I would like to note is the bezel, I think, is really nicely done. The steel looks really nice just against the black dial. Obviously, the kind of printing is done really nicely. It looks crisp, it looks clean. I like the black infill that kind of matches with the black dial. It all looks really nice and is executed well. Of course, it's not Christopher Ward's original design, but it doesn't really matter at this point. The case back is fairly plain, and honestly, this movement in itself isn't the most kind of visible. You know, there is really a lot of plates in the way, so you can't really see many of the mechanisms, but it is nice to have an open case back, and that Christopher Ward went the extra mile to decorate the rotor in their unique way. Again, the bracelet here has these quick release spring bars, which are really sturdy. They aren't as flimsy feeling as some of the other kind of regular strap quick release bars, so that's nice to see. Sometimes it actually is kind of hard to like depress them down and get it in there in the right way, but it's a good feeling versus being like unfairly tough. Looking a little bit at the bracelet, we do see we have a kind of nice channeling here, so the kind of wrist has some area to breathe as it's on the wrist. The bracelet, of course, in the traditional 3-link style, male end links that extend the length of the case just a slight bit. We do end at a nice deployant clasp with a flip lock or a double push button deployant. Nice kind of Christopher Ward flag logo on the clasp here, still all brushed there. We also do have some micro adjust in the clasp here, which is really nice. You just kind of depress this in and you can move it in and out at will, which is really nice for that just on the fly adjustment, pretty easy to do. And then just really quickly before we move on, one thing I'd like to note is, one, the knurling on the crown is pretty good, just like the other C63, but in comparison, the winding experience is a lot smoother. And of course, they are using different movements, but this GMT SW330 movement has a really nice, just kind of quality, smooth feel to the winding experience. It's not overly loud. It feels like it's refined and a little bit more. So it really is a pleasurable watch to wind. And if you're trying to almost justify the price difference between the GMT and the three-hander, the quality of the movement and obviously the increased power reserve definitely are in the favor of this watch. So moving on to how the watch wears, earlier I was wearing the C63 three-hander, and I wanted to bring this in not only because I think people will be looking at the two watches, but just to kind of compare them side by side. So of course the cases of these watches are pretty much identical. It just comes down to what I think the GMT just executes everything a little bit better. I think the orange does work a little bit better than the red tones of the three-hander. And I also mentioned in my C63 review here that I felt this watch was a little too simple for a sports watch. It didn't lean enough into its sports nature. And I know that's the kind of like the line is trying to kind of toe between, but the GMT over here leans much more into the sports watch territory with the numerical bezel here, with this kind of added GMT hand. It just feels more sporty, it looks more sporty, and I feel like it feels like more of a complete package. This watch tries to be a dress watch and a sports watch at the same time, and by consequence doesn't do best of either. This GMT, I think, is an amazing sports watch. So here we have the Christopher Ward on my 6.5-inch wrist, and as you can tell, it wears amazingly well. Again, this is a really ergonomically sculpted case, so it sits really nicely on wrist. It doesn't kind of rise above the wrist at all. It really just fit flush. It doesn't overhang in the lugs. It just looks good and it feels nice on wrist. It doesn't dig in any uncomfortable way. It doesn't have any really sharp edges to the bracelet or anything like that. And this kind of, in comparing this wearing experience to, like, let's say the Manta Atlas that I reviewed, this is a much more comfortable case. The Atlas tries to get that kind of Rolex feel by having really sharp case sides and a sharply constructed bracelet. And while it looks nice from off a wrist, it's not the most comfortable thing on wrist. And this is kind of the opposite in that it doesn't try to be overly built for no reason. It just is nice and it feels good on wrist. It's well executed and it's a pleasure to wear. Looking at the side here, we can see that the Christopher Ward does conform really nicely to the wrist. Again, just kind of sits right on top of there. Nothing rises up, lots of flexion and no uncomfortable digging at all. It really is just a comfortable watch. It doesn't seem unnecessarily thick for a GMT because it really isn't. At 12 millimeters, it is a pretty thin GMT, all things considered. And again, only half a millimeter taller than its three-headed brother. Just really quickly moving the watch a little lower below my wrist bone, I have closer to like a 6-inch wrist here, and I think you can see it still does wear well. Even the male end links aren't really overhanging by any means. So you can wear this watch on a 6-inch wrist, maybe even smaller, and it still will look nice. You can wear this on, above a 7-inch, maybe 7.5-inch wrist, just depending on how small you like their watches, because it does have a nice kind of expansive dial because it's not overly cluttered, so it will look large even on larger wrists. Moving on to some other straps, here we have this nice distressed leather from Vario. I believe I put this strap on the C63 as well, and I just think this is one of those straps that works almost with every watch. Looks good on this one, really nice kind of casual grain to it, and yeah, just really like the strap. And there we have it on wrist, wears well, again, just like the other C63, no lug gap there, which is really nice to see, and feels great. And then here we have the watch on the crown and buckle Chevron strap. I believe this is their Harris tweed. But I'll put a link in the description to it. I think it pairs really well with just the black dial, the orange hand, and kind of like the stainless steel look of the case, just kind of, shades of gray. And here we have the watch on wrist, and I think it looks great, adds a nice little texture to the watch. And the benefit of this watch being such a thin GMT is that you can add a single pass strap, and it's still not too thick at all, which is really nice. Here we have this nice leather Nato from Benchmark straps off of Amazon. Super thin and just a nice kind of tan color that I think goes really well with the tones of the dial. And there we have it on wrist. One of my favorite combos because I just think this kind of tan brown works really well. And last but not least, the Barton Elite silicone strap. I prefer it on this than the Archer strap because this gives it a slightly more sporty feel and adds a nice texture to the watch. And of course, thank you Christopher Ward for going for a nice white Lume signature that matches my white silicone straps. There we have it on wrist, really comfortable, looks great, makes the watch a lot more brighter, a lot more fun, and yeah, no complaints here. Looking at the Christopher Ward all loomed up here, I think you can tell it has a pretty nice glow to it. Christopher Ward did a pretty good job on the application here. It shines pretty brightly, the application is pretty good. Of course it's not going to last forever, but while it does last, it's very readable, really great orientation. I think maybe some people can get mixed up between the GMT hand and the hour hand, very rarely, but there is still enough delineation in the fact that one's smaller and one's farther out towards the edge. Reluming and comparing to the Snoopy here, they have a pretty similar color temperature, a pretty similar brightness, so I think overall Christopher Ward did a pretty good job on the Lume application, and I really have no complaints. So pros and cons of this Christopher Ward GMT, and I think the first major pro will be it's a great design. Now, obviously, Christopher Ward didn't necessarily design this watch. It very much looks like the Rolex Explorer, and that's why it looks so good, because it is a good design. But nonetheless, it has enough elements that makes it a unique Christopher Ward watch, and it is also at a 39mm size, which Rolex has never made, so I actually prefer the way this one wears. Another pro of the watch would be that it just is super ergonomic. As with my other C63 review, this is just a great case shape. It fits well, it's really well sized in both diameter and in length, so it will fit on a wide variety of wrists and look good on them all. So Christopher Ward really did hit it out of the park with this case design, and it really is worth the price you're paying. And my last pro will just be the fact that this is an amazing watch at the price. For under $1,000, especially if you're using the Christopher Ward complimentary $125 discount, you're getting probably the best GMT under at least $2,000. I would take this over Manta Atlas. I would take this over a Laurier Hyperion. This is one of the best GMTs I've come across in really any price point. It is a really, really well executed watch. Moving on to cons, and I really don't have a lot for this watch at all. One of my main cons is just the fact that it uses male end links. It does extend the length of the case slightly. I just kind of usually prefer a female end link. It doesn't look horrible, and I think it does still look good with the design. I would have just probably preferred a female end link, and as it stands, it's not bad. The only other slight con I have with the watch is the fact that, you know, it uses orange. I mean, orange can be a divisive color. It can maybe not match with as many straps had it been just a regular black and white monochromatic theme. But as it stands, it still does look good. Obviously, the Rolex Explorer uses orange, so why not this watch? And it's not in your face. It's not too much in any way, so it still is tastefully done. So final thoughts on this watch, and really it is one that even from the pictures I thought was going to be really good, and it is. I think if you are at all even interested in this watch, buying this watch, owning this watch for any period of time, it will be well worth it to you. Like I said in the pro section, this is something I would pick over pretty much any other GMT, like at all. I'd pick this over a Tudor Black Bay. I'd pick this over a Monta Atlas. I'd pick this over a Laurier Hyperion. It is just not only a well-executed watch, but I think the design is really, really strong. The only thing you have to overcome is the fact that it says Christopher Ward on the dial. And for some of you, that may be a big deal. Some of you, it may not be. But at the end of the day, I think it is an amazingly well-built watch, really well executed. You get that newer movement that has, I believe, a 56-hour power reserve, which is really awesome for a GMT. And, you know, this is a type of design that a lot of people look for. You know, Grand Seiko has a style that's similar to this. Of course, everyone wants the Rolex Explorer, more specifically the Polar more often than not, but it is a popular design, and for good reason, because it looks good, and Christopher Ward definitely did the watch justice. So I hope you enjoyed the review. I hope you got something out of it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another one.